At the end of the last talk, what we saw is that as we increase the angle of attack of a wing, we increase the amount of lift it generates. But there's a limit to the amount of lift that we can create from a wing, because if we exceed a certain angle, then the flow separates and the lift decreases. And this angle is known as the stall angle, and it's due to the flow separating from the upper surface of the wing. Now, why does the flow separate from the upper surface of the wing? Well, it's due to the presence of something called the boundary layer, and the boundary layer is a region of the flow next to the surface, only a few millimeters or centimeters thick, where the effects of the viscosity of air are felt. Now, most people would understand that syrup is a viscous fluid, and that if I was to have a cup of viscous syrup and try and stir it with a spoon, I'd feel a certain resistance due to the stickiness of the fluid, due to its viscosity. However, air doesn't feel very viscous, and if I move a spoon through air, it doesn't really feel much resistance. But air is viscous, and the effect of the viscosity is found in this boundary layer right next to the surface of anything with the fluid moving over the top of it. Now, because of the effect of viscosity, we have something which is known as the non-slip condition. That if a fluid passes over a surface, then right next to the surface the flow is brought to rest. Irrespective of what the free stream velocity is, right next to the surface, due to viscosity, the flow will be brought to rest. So if I have an aircraft flying at 500 knots, then the free stream velocity will be 500 knots, but the velocity of the flow right next to the surface of the wing or the fuselage will be 0. If I have the flow of the atmosphere over the Earth, then okay, I might have a 20 knot velocity up at 2,000 or 3,000 feet, but right next to the surface of the Earth the velocity will be 0. And this is the wind gradient, and you'll hear instructors talking about flying through the wind gradient when you're coming into land on a very windy day. So every surface over which a fluid flows has 0 velocity on the surface and a change in the velocity from 0 out to the free stream. And this region is known as the boundary layer. And as I say, it can be anything up to a kilometre thick over the Earth, and it can be only a few millimeters thick over the wing of a jet transport. And we can see this boundary layer being developed by flowing water over a wing, having a thin wire across which we pass a voltage, and if we pulse that we can get lines of hydrogen bubbles in the flow. And what we can see here is this curved shape next to the surface of the wing where the flow is brought to rest due to the viscosity and the no-slip condition. And if we look at that flow through the converging duct that we saw earlier on when we discussed Bernoulli's equation, we see the presence of the boundary layer on the walls. Down here, as the bubble line starts moving down the duct, we can see next to the surface the bubbles are sticking to the surface, and as the flow accelerates, the flow sticking to the bottom surface causes this curved shape in the velocity profile through the duct, because next to the surface the flow is brought to rest. Now, the flow is brought to rest by the viscosity of the fluid, the stickiness of the fluid, but we also have pressures changing on an airfoil, and over the front of an airfoil we have the pressure dropping with distance, and over the rear of the airfoil we have the pressure increasing with distance. Now, that pressure decreasing and increasing within the flow has an effect on the boundary layer. So imagine we have our boundary layer on the surface of our airfoil, 0 velocity at the surface, gradually changing out to the free stream conditions, and there's our boundary layer, only a couple of millimeters or centimeters thick. Now, if I have a little element of fluid inside the boundary layer over at the leading edge of the wing, then what I would see is that upstream I would have a high pressure, but because the flow is accelerating on the downstream face of that little element of fluid, there would be a low pressure. And because I have a pressure difference across that element of fluid, then that low pressure would suck the fluid along and accelerate the flow in the boundary layer. So over the front of the wing, the boundary layer will remain nice and thin and what's known as attached. However, over the back surface of the wing, the pressure increases with distance. And so now, over my little fluid element, the low pressure is on the front surface and there's a high pressure on the back surface. So now the force due to the pressure is acting in the opposite direction to the flow. And so that element of fluid is being slowed down by the viscosity and also by the pressure difference. And so the boundary layer starts to get thicker and the flow next to the wall starts to get slower because of this what's known as adverse pressure gradient, pressure increasing with distance acting on the flow in the boundary layer. Now if the flow on the surface is zero, which is the non-slip condition, and if the flow just off the surface is slowed down such that its velocity is also zero, then what we end up with is that the flow cannot follow the surface anymore, because the flow on the surface is zero, the flow just off the surface is zero, and therefore we've got a blockage in the flow, and the flow will separate from the surface. Now, this will happen towards the back end of an airfoil, even at low angles of attack. But as I gradually increase the angle of attack, what happens is that the rate at which the pressure changes, because the flow is speeding up to a much higher velocity due to being at a higher angle of attack, then the flow has to slow down more quickly. The rate at which the pressure increases over the back surface of the wing increases more quickly, and therefore the flow will separate from the surface closer to the leading edge, and therefore we'll get this boundary layer stall, the flow separating from the surface of the wing. Now, why is this a problem? Well, let's imagine that we're flying along, we're balancing our lift and our weight, then as we fly slower, the amount of lift we would generate for a given angle of attack becomes less. So in order to balance lift and weight as we fly slower, we have to fly gradually at a higher angle of attack. And as we fly slower and slower and gradually increase our angle of attack to balance lift and weight, we have to be careful that we don't exceed the stall angle and therefore have flow separate. And the minimum possible speed at which we can fly an aircraft occurs at the stall angle.